Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. As you all know, we have started a series on diuretics. In the first video, we covered carbonic anhydrase inhibitors. In the second video, we discussed about loop diuretics. And today, we are moving to the third part, that is thiazide diuretics. So I will be completing thiazide diuretics into two videos. In today's video, I will be focusing only on the distal convoluted tubule and mechanism of action of thiazide diuretics. So let's get started. So thiazide diuretics. Thiazide diuretics are a class of diuretics that act on distal convoluted tubule. In the nephron, they act on the distal convoluted tubule. These thiazide diuretics, they act on distal convoluted tubule. So, before going into the depth of how thiazide diuretics work, let us first see how reabsorption takes place within the distal convoluted tubule. The distal convoluted tubule, it reabsorbs around 8 to 10% of the sodium. Now, how this reabsorption takes place? The DCT cell, distal convoluted tubular cell, they have apical lumen, apical surface which faces the lumen. Then they have a basal surface. Then they have a lateral surface. Okay. Now, the apical surface which is facing the lumen, it consists of a cotransporter known as sodium chloride cotransporter, NCCT. This sodium chloride cotransporter or symporter, it transports the sodium and chloride from the lumen into the cell of the distal convoluted tubule. So, once the sodium and chloride enters into the cell, sodium moves from the cell into the interstitium via the basal and lateral sides with the help of sodium-potassium pump or sodium-potassium ATPases. This moves the sodium out of the cell and brings back potassium into the cell. Chloride also exits via the chloride channels. Chloride also exits via the chloride channels into the interstitium. In addition to this sodium chloride cotransporter, the apical surface of the distal convoluted tubular cell also contains calcium channels. It also contains calcium channels. These calcium channels transport the calcium from the lumen into the cell of the distal convoluted tubule. But these calcium channels, they are sensitive to a hormone known as parathyroid hormone. This hormone is produced by the chief cells of the parathyroid gland. Once this parathyroid hormone is released, it acts on the serpentine receptor which is present on the membrane of the distal convoluted tubular cell. Once this serpentine receptor is activated, it results in it increases the insertion, it inserts more and more calcium channels on the luminal side or on the apical side of the distal convoluted tubule. And number one was it increased the insertion. It increased the number of calcium channels. Number two, it increases the activity of these calcium channels. So the end result is more and more calcium will be transported from the lumen into the cell of the distal convoluted tubule. Now the cell is loaded with calcium. Calcium is transported out of the cell into the interstitium to get reabsorbed back into the blood, that is peritubular capillaries, with the help of a with the help of an antiporter or exchanger known as sodium calcium exchanger. What this exchanger does, as we know, The interstitium contains sodium. This sodium is pumped into the cell. 3 sodium ions are pumped into the cell in exchange of 1 calcium ion. So sodium is brought back into the cell, while as calcium is pumped out of the cell so that it gets reabsorbed into the peritubular capillaries. And one more thing about distal convoluted tubule is the early part of the distal convoluted tubule is completely impermeable to water. The late part of the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct, the permeability depends upon antidiuretic hormone. If antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin is released, then through aquaporins, this last part of distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct becomes water permeable. Now, let us see how these thiazide diuretics work. What these thiazide diuretics do, they block the NCCT, sodium chloride cotransporter. Once this cotransporter is blocked, so more sodium, more chloride will remain in the lumen because reabsorption is now blocked. So it prevents reabsorption of sodium and chloride into the lumen. Okay, so now sodium and chloride reabsorption will be reduced. At the same time, we also know that we have calcium channels on the apical side. So calcium will be reabsorbed. Calcium will be reabsorbed. Once calcium will be reabsorbed, we have to move out the calcium from the cell into the interstitium. For this, again, sodium will help us. Usually, students raise a question that, sir, sodium and chloride is not reabsorbed. Then once it is not reabsorbed, sodium is not reabsorbed, sodium potassium pump will not work, will not move the more sodium. So how this sodium will help in reabsorption of this reabsorption of calcium? See, the interstitium, it has sodium. As compared to the cell, the sodium level within the interstitium is more than the cell. So there is a concentration gradient. More sodium is present in the interstitium as compared to the DCT cell. So what this concentration gradient does, it results in calcium movement out of the cell and sodium movement back into the distal convoluted tubular cell via the sodium calcium exchanger. So sodium calcium exchanger, what it does, it pumps out calcium into the interstitium, and from the interstitium it moves sodium back into the distal convoluted tubular cell. This is how these diuretics, these thiazide diuretics, they increase the reabsorption of calcium from the lumen. Now, more sodium, more chloride will reach the last part of the nephron. So, once more sodium reaches the last part of the nephron, the principal cell, they get activated. They use sodium potassium ATPases to pump sodium into the cell, and once sodium is pumped into the cell with the help of sodium potassium, the potassium is excreted or the potassium leaks out into the lumen. This leads to caliuresis. So, sodium chloride cotransporter was blocked. Calcium got reabsorbed via the calcium channels. Calcium moved out of the cell into the interstitium via the sodium calcium exchanger. So, sodium calcium exchanger, with the help of this exchanger, the calcium moved out of the cell into the interstitium. Since sodium calcium exchanger, what it does, it moves calcium out of the cell. So inside the cell, the calcium level decreases. That is why more and more calcium is reabsorbed from these calcium channels. Finally, I discussed about that more sodium reaches the last part of the nephron. sodium reabsorption increases. All of the sodium is not reabsorbed, but small amount of sodium is reabsorbed. Okay, that small amount of sodium reabsorption which results in potassium exits. So finally potassium exits out of the principal cell into the lumen. This explains that thiazide diuretics are also potassium wasters. So the end result is that these these thiazide diuretics, they call natriuresis. They cause diuresis, although mild as compared to loop diuretics. Diuresis is also not that much strong as compared to thiazide diuresis, loop diuretic, caliuresis, and chloride loss with urine. Now, the question arises, if if DCT if DCT is water impermeable, if DCT is water impermeable, early part, how does it leads to diuresis? Because when it is water impermeable, whether the sodium is more or less, it will not affect the water concentration. Let us consider there is secretion of anti-diuretic hormone. Once anti-diuretic hormone is released, the last part of DCT and collecting duct, we can say the last part of nephron, it becomes water permeable. So when the last part of nephron becomes water permeable, so more and more water will be reabsorbed, is it? But once we are prescribing thiazides, what happens in these thiazides? They block the sodium chloride cotransporter, so more and more sodium is delivered to the last part of nephron. So even if there is anti-diuretic hormone, more sodium, more chloride, more ions are present in the nephron, since it is usually more than normal sodium present in the last part of the nephron, so sodium will be followed by water. That is why even if there is presence of anti-diuretic hormone, these thiazide diuretics can still further lead to diuresis, although not a strong high ceiling diuretic like loop diuretics, but they are recommended as first line treatment in cases of hypertension. Why? Because sodium is excreted out, small amount of diuresis also occurs, so the net result is the sodium is excreted out, the water is also excreted out, so it decreases the blood volume, finally it decreases the blood pressure. Also, this drug is prescribed in patients who have hypercalciuria because it allows the distal convoluted tubule to reabsorb the calcium, so that in the last part of the nephron it doesn't lead to urine hypersaturation and crystallization formation and finally stone formation. It can also be prescribed to patients who have osteoporosis because it increases the reabsorption of calcium into the blood. So this was all about the mechanism of action of thiazide diuretics. So if you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and thank you so much for watching.